In the movie Schindler's List, Liam Neeson's character, Oskar Schindler, is crying. He says to Ishtak Stern, his accountant and friend, "If only I could have sold this watch, I could have saved 2 more Jews. If only I had sold this automobile, I could have saved 10 more." He is bemoaning the fate of some of his Polish workers. But Stern, Jewish himself, says back to Schindler, "You did what you could do." The Mishnah says, "He who saves one life saves the world." Years later, when Oskar Schindler dies, hundreds and hundreds of Jews, 1,200 to be exact, known today as Schindler Jews, and their offspring trekked to Schindler's grave to each place a stone on top of it, a symbol of blessing and respect to him for having saved their lives from the German-initiated Holocaust. Indeed, Schindler's descendants were many. His influence, profound. Schindler's story is not so much unlike the story of Abraham or Abram in the Bible. Abraham has no offspring of his own when God first approaches him. The Lord promises him that he will be a great nation. But Abraham answers, "How? The heir of my house is one of my slaves. I have no descendants. I have no offspring." God replies, "I will do it. Look toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. So shall your descendants be." You see, God has always been in the business of producing results that we would deem impossible. God's strong suit, as it were, is accomplishing the unheard of. Multitudes fed from 5 loaves and 2 fish, unheard of. An army of Israelites walking through the Red Sea, unheard of. Stilling storms and accomplishing resurrection, unheard of. But let me give you a more recent example than those. It's not 21st century, but it is from the 5th century, and I share it with you precisely because today, as we've already noted, is St. Patrick's Day. And I'm not sure how much you know about him, but he led an extraordinary life of faith. Patrick was actually born British, not Irish. But when he was 16 years old, he was taken captive by Irish pirates from his home in Britain. Yes, this is a true story. And made a slave in Ireland. His enslavement involved being a tender of animals and livestock. And he performed these duties for 6 years before escaping and returning to his family in Britain. And here's where the story becomes interesting. Because whereas most people would want to get as far away as possible and stay as far away as possible from a locale in a country where they had been imprisoned and enslaved, Patrick instead returns to Ireland and becomes a missionary, a Christian missionary to the very people and country that had made his life so onerous and challenging. Patrick converts thousands to the faith. They had largely been polytheistic prior to his arrival, and he is consequently known today as the Apostle of Ireland, and alternatively as the patron saint of Ireland and the enlightener of Ireland. Legend has it that he used the shamrock, the 3-leafed clover, to illustrate the Christian teaching of the Trinity. St. Patrick died on the 17th of March, which is why we remember and celebrate his life on this day. Now just think of all the descendants that this slave of Ireland had. Though he had no natural children of his own, being a priest with no spouse, he nevertheless could count his Irish stars and understand that God had created a multitude of offspring from Patrick and from his faithful servants, from his faithful obedience. In fact, in Ireland, the feast of St. Patrick, or St. Patrick's Day, is celebrated as a holy day of obligation. Obligation. Obliged to what? To witness, to serve, to sacrifice. And my sisters and brothers in Christ, when we are willing to do those things, God miraculously provides us with spiritual descendants. Descendants who follow in our ways of service and integrity and character. Make no mistake, we cannot make those kind of descendants on our own. Only God can. And so I am reminded of several times during the year when our calendars say things like Mother's Day, Father's Day, Parents' Day, Grandparents' Day. And years ago in the Presbyterian Church, we as a body determined that Mother's Day would not merely be designated Mother's Day. It would simultaneously be designated Women of the Church Day. Because there are those women who either cannot or choose not to have children of their own, who nevertheless have descendants of their character, offspring of their faith, women and men, girls and boys who've been touched by their lives, influenced by their actions, creating a legacy of service and action. Should not these women also be recognized and honored on Mother's Day when they have given birth to so many disciplined and influential lives? Presbyterian Church, for one, says yes. Likewise, shouldn't a St. Patrick be honored on Father's Day, now also known in the Presbyterian Church as Men of the Church Day? Yes. And shouldn't an Oscar Schindler be recognized on Grandparents' Day, having produced so many faithful offspring, a multitude of nations, descendants who carry on his selfless witness and his surprising service? You know, in this day and age when we castigate Jews and Muslims, when we traffic in racial slurs and stereotypes, when a person's skin tint and religious moniker and ethnic identity is somehow supposed to define all of who they are and what they represent, we would do well to recall that God pays little attention to the outward appearance, to the external shell, and instead gets down to the heart, penetrating to the person underneath. God cares more about the moral, ethical, and spiritual descendants that we have than the mere physical offspring that we sport, though they are cherished and loved too, of course. For my friends, God can make something out of absolutely nothing. God can produce followers of God's character and God's purpose where there were none before. God can still do that today. So allow me to ask you, who are your spiritual descendants? And who are mine? For me, I can think of a handful of persons who are walking more closely with God today because of my ministry and influence than they might otherwise have walked before. How about you? We're all disciples of Christ. Do you have some descendants of your own, of your faith, of your character, who are stronger today because you've been around, you've been in their lives? Sometimes we may not even know who those people are, but they've heard you say something or seen you do something that's faithful, that's of service, that has had an impact, and they've taken note of it, perhaps without even ever letting you know that they were watching. But they were paying attention. The message you've sent out to them, the communication that you've made to them, has made a difference. You've made a difference. For the thing is, Abraham couldn't see his descendants at the time that he received God's promise. They were nowhere in sight. And that's what was so challenging about it for him. Still, God didn't chide him or ridicule him for his lack of understanding or his lack of faith. Instead, God gave him a simple yet impossible thing to do. God told him to look toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. Now, Abraham knew how to count stars, but surely he immediately realized how futile would be his attempt to count every single one of them. He probably suddenly understood, perhaps with a knowing grin, that God really didn't want him to do that. God simply wanted him to have faith, to believe in what could not yet be seen. So shall your descendants be, the Creator concludes. And so shall our descendants be too, my friends. For we, as some of those very descendants of Abraham, you and me, shall in turn produce out of our faith, out of our hope, descendants of our own who will walk with God, do justice, love mercy, and who will make an impact on our society and on our culture today. And even if we cannot count all the stars in the sky, we can nevertheless look up in faith. We can look to God and trust that even when our sight and our understanding are limited, God has a plan. God has a promise. All God really requires of us is that we believe and that we remain ready to count the blessings that God will give. Are you ready? I am, if you are. Amen.